Grace's hands shook as she held the old photograph. Henry lay in the hospital bed, his breathing slow and heavy. The machines beeped softly around him. After 60 years of marriage, 60 years of holding each other through storms and sunshine, she was about to tell him something that could change everything. "Henry," she whispered, tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. "There's something I should have told you a long, long time ago." Henry's tired eyes opened. Even now, even sick and weak, his eyes were kind. They were the same eyes that had looked at her with love when she was just 18 years old, standing in her father's garage in North Carolina. That was where it all began. Grace McDonald was not supposed to fall in love with Henry Johnson. In 1945, in the small town of Greenville, North Carolina, white girls did not talk to black boys. They certainly did not fall in love with them. Grace's father owned the biggest car repair shop in town, and he was a powerful man. People listened when he spoke. People feared him when he was angry. But Grace was different from other girls. She loved reading books under the oak tree behind her house. She loved music, jazz records that her mother said were too wild for a proper young lady. And she hated the way people in her town treated black folks, like they were somehow less than human. One hot summer day, everything changed. Grace's father had hired a new mechanic. His name was Henry Johnson, and he was only 20 years old. Henry had hands that could fix anything: broken engines, stuck doors, rusty old bicycles. When Grace first saw him, he was bent over a car engine, sweat on his forehead, completely focused on his work. "Excuse me," Grace said softly. Henry looked up. For a moment, their eyes met, and Grace felt something strange and wonderful flutter in her chest, like a bird trying to fly for the first time. "Yes, miss," Henry said politely, looking down quickly. He knew the rules. Black men did not look at white women for too long. I just wanted to say that's beautiful work," Grace said, pointing at the engine he had just fixed. "My father says you're the best mechanic he's ever seen." Henry smiled just a little. "Thank you, miss. I love what I do." That was the beginning. Over the next few months, Grace found reasons to visit her father's shop. She would bring lemonade on hot days. She would ask Henry questions about cars, even though she already knew the answers. Slowly, carefully, they became friends. They talked about music. Henry played the harmonica and loved the blues. They talked about dreams. Henry wanted to open his own shop someday, where he could be his own boss. Grace wanted to travel, to see places beyond the small, suffocating town where everyone knew everyone's business. But they had to be careful, very, very careful. They met in secret, behind the old church at midnight. They wrote letters and hid them in a hollow tree. Grace's heart would race every time she saw Henry, and she absolutely knew that this was love, real love, the kind of love that songs were written about. But danger was always close. One evening, Grace's father caught them talking near the shop. His face turned red with rage. "What do you think you're doing? Talking to my daughter?" he roared at Henry. "Sir, I meant no disrespect," Henry began. Get out of my shop. If I ever see you near Grace again, I'll make sure you regret it." Grace cried that night. She cried because she knew what her father's threats meant. In 1945, in North Carolina, a black man could be hurt, or worse, just for being accused of looking at a white woman the wrong way. But Henry and Grace were not going to give up. 2 weeks later, on a dark Tuesday night, they ran away together. Grace packed a small bag with her clothes, her favorite books, and the little money she had saved. Henry borrowed his cousin's old truck. They drove north through the night, their hearts pounding with fear and excitement. "Are you scared?" Henry asked as they crossed into Virginia. "Terrified," Grace admitted, "but I'm more scared of living without you." Henry reached over and held her hand. His hand was rough from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "I promise you, Grace, I'll work hard every day. I'll build us a good life. You won't regret this." "I already know I won't," Grace said. They drove for hours and hours, until the sun came up and painted the sky pink and gold. By the time they reached Ohio, they were exhausted but hopeful. Ohio was different from North Carolina. There were still problems, Still people who hated seeing a white woman and a black man together. But there were also places where they could be safe, where they could be free. In Cleveland, Ohio, they found a tiny apartment in a neighborhood where other mixed couples lived. The apartment had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and windows that looked out at the street. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. 3 months after they arrived, Henry and Grace got married. There were no fancy flowers or big parties, just a simple ceremony at City Hall, with 2 strangers as witnesses. Grace wore a blue dress she had bought from a second-hand store. Henry wore his only suit, cleaned and pressed until it looked almost new. When the judge said, "You may kiss your bride," Henry kissed Grace softly, and she felt like she was floating. "Mrs. Grace Johnson," Henry whispered. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Grace said, laughing through happy tears. But even on her wedding day, even as she smiled and kissed her new husband, there was a shadow in Grace's heart, a secret, something she had never told Henry, something she had never told anyone. Before she met Henry, when she was just 16 years old, something terrible had happened, something she had buried deep inside, hoping it would disappear forever. But secrets never really disappear. They wait, they grow, and one day they demand to be told. Henry and Grace's early years in Cleveland were not easy. They were poor, so poor that some nights they ate only bread and soup for dinner. Henry worked at a big garage, fixing cars for other people. He came home every night with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in his bones. But he never complained. "One day, Grace," he would say, sitting at their small kitchen table, "one day I'll have my own shop, Johnson's Auto Repair, and you'll never have to worry about money again." Grace believed him. She worked too, cleaning houses for wealthy families on the other side of town. The women she worked for sometimes looked at her with confusion and disgust when they learned she was married to a black man. "How could you?" one woman asked her, whispering like it was the worst secret in the world. "How could you marry one of them?" Grace looked the woman straight in the eye. "I married the kindest, hardest working man I've ever known. That's how." She never went back to that house. In 1947, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified and thrilled at the same time. When she told Henry, he picked her up and spun her around their tiny apartment, laughing with pure joy. "We're going to be parents," he shouted. "Our baby is going to have everything we didn't have. Everything." Their daughter, Sarah, was born in the spring of 1948. She had Henry's dark eyes and Grace's smile. When Grace held her for the first time, she cried. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming love. But even in that perfect moment, the secret whispered in her mind. "You had another baby once. You had a son. Where is he now?" Grace pushed the thought away. She pushed it deep down where it couldn't hurt her. 3 years later, their son Marcus was born. Now they were a family of 4, squeezed into their small apartment. Money was still tight, but they were happy. On Sundays, Henry would play his harmonica while Grace sang, and the children would dance around the living room. But life in Cleveland was not always safe. One night, when Sarah was 5 and Marcus was 2, someone threw a rock through their window. The glass shattered everywhere. A note was tied to the rock. "Go back where you came from." Grace screamed. Henry grabbed a broom and started sweeping up the glass, his jaw tight with anger. "Why do people hate us so much?" Grace cried. "We're not hurting anyone." Henry pulled her close. "Because they're scared, Grace. Scared that the world is changing. Scared that people like us are proof they're wrong about everything they believe." "I'm tired of being scared," Grace whispered. "I know," Henry said, "but we're not going anywhere. This is our home. This is our life. And no rock through a window is going to change that." And they didn't leave. They stayed. They fought. They survived. By 1960, things started to get better. Henry finally saved enough money to rent a small garage. Johnson's Auto Repair opened on a rainy Monday morning. Grace stood beside him, holding Marcus's hand, while Sarah cut the ribbon with big scissors. "I told you," Henry said, grinning at Grace. "I told you we'd make it." And they did make it. Henry's shop grew. People came from all over Cleveland because they knew Henry was honest and his work was excellent. He hired other mechanics, black men and white men, and treated everyone with respect. Grace started helping with the shop's bookkeeping. She was good with numbers, and she loved working beside her husband. At night, after the shop closed, they would sit together in the office, counting the day's earnings, planning for the future. "We should buy a house," Henry said one evening. "A real house with a yard, somewhere safe for Sarah and Marcus." In 1965, they bought their first home. It was a small brick house with 3 bedrooms, a front porch, and an oak tree in the backyard. Grace cried when she saw it. "It's perfect," she whispered. Sarah grew up to be a teacher. Marcus became an engineer. Both of them went to college, something Grace and Henry had only dreamed about when they were young. Henry and Grace were so proud. They thought their hearts might burst. But as the years passed, as their children grew up and moved away, as Grace and Henry grew older together, the secret became heavier. Grace would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing. She would think about the baby she had given away when she was just 16. A baby boy with tiny fingers and eyes that had barely opened before the nurses took him away. She had been so young, so scared. Her parents had sent her away to stay with an aunt in another town. When the baby was born, they made her sign papers, adoption papers. They told her it was for the best. "You'll forget about this," her mother had said coldly. "You'll move on." This never happened. But Grace had never forgotten, not for one single day. She had never told Henry, not when they first met, not when they got married, not when Sarah was born or Marcus, or any time in between. The secret had become like a wall between them, invisible but always there. Why hadn't she told him? She was ashamed. She was scared he would think differently of her. She was afraid that knowing about the baby would somehow hurt their family, their children, their beautiful life together. But secrets have a cost. The cost was the guilt that ate at Grace's heart for 60 years. The cost was lying awake at night, wondering where her first son was. Was he happy? Was he alive? Did he ever wonder about his real mother? In 2005, Henry started feeling sick. At first, it was just tiredness. Then came the coughing. Then the pain in his chest. The doctors did tests and found cancer. It was in his lungs, and it had spread. How long? Henry asked the doctor quietly. "Maybe 6 months," the doctor said. "Maybe a year if we're lucky." Henry held Grace's hand in the doctor's office. Grace could barely breathe. 60 years together, and now time was running out. Henry was 79 years old. Grace was 77. They had built a life that most people said was impossible. They had survived hatred, poverty, and pain. They had raised good children and built a successful business. But there was still something unfinished between them. As Henry got sicker, as he grew weaker and thinner, Grace knew she couldn't keep the secret anymore. She couldn't let him die without knowing the truth. He deserved the truth. After everything they had been through together, he deserved honesty. One night, Grace sat beside Henry's hospital bed. Sarah and Marcus had just left after visiting. The room was quiet except for the beeping machines. Grace took out an old photograph she had kept hidden for 60 years. It was a picture of her when she was 16, pregnant, her face sad and scared. "Henry," she said softly, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you the day we met." Henry's eyes opened. Even through his pain, even through his exhaustion, he looked at her with love. "What is it, Grace?" he whispered. Grace's hand shook. Her voice broke, but she knew it was time. "Before I met you," she began, "when I was 16 years old, I had a baby, a son. My parents made me give him up for adoption. I never told you. I'm so sorry, Henry. I'm so sorry." The room went completely silent. And then Henry did something Grace never expected. Henry reached out his weak hand and touched Grace's cheek. His fingers were cold, but his touch was warm with love. "Grace," he said softly, "why are you crying?" "Because I lied to you," Grace sobbed. "For 60 years I lied. I kept this enormous secret from you. You must hate me." Henry shook his head slowly. "Hate you?" "Grace, look at me." Grace looked into his eyes, those kind, Beautiful eyes she had loved since she was 18. You were 16 years old, Henry said. You were just a child. Your parents forced you. You were scared and alone. Grace, I could never hate you for that. But I should have told you. Grace cried. Before we got married, before we had Sarah and Marcus, before everything, I should have been honest. Henry squeezed her hand. Maybe, but I understand why you didn't. You were ashamed of something that wasn't your fault. You were protecting yourself. He paused, breathing heavily. Grace, do you know where he is? Your son. Grace shook her head. No. I tried to find him once, 20 years ago, but the adoption agency said the records were sealed. They wouldn't tell me anything. Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. Find him, Grace. What? After I'm gone, Henry said, his voice getting weaker. I want you to find him. I want you to tell him about us, about our family. Tell him about his mother, the bravest, strongest woman I've ever known. Tell him about me, too, if you want. Tell him he had a stepfather who would have loved him. Grace broke down completely, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Henry, I love you so much. I love you, too, Grace. I always have. I always will. If you're enjoying the story of love, truth, and healing, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will touch your heart. Henry died 3 weeks later, on a sunny Tuesday morning. Grace was holding his hand. Sarah and Marcus were there too. In his last moments, Henry smiled at Grace and whispered, Find him. Promise me. I promise, Grace said. I promise. And then he was gone. The funeral was beautiful. People came from all over Cleveland. Mechanics who had worked with Henry, customers whose cars he had fixed, neighbors who had known the family for decades. Everyone had stories about Henry's kindness, his hard work, his gentle spirit. But Grace felt hollow inside. For 60 years, Henry had been her partner, her best friend, her everything. Now the house felt too big and too empty. The bed felt cold. The silence was unbearable. Sarah and Marcus stayed with Grace for a few weeks, but eventually they had to return to their own lives. Grace was alone. One morning, Grace woke up and remembered Henry's words. Find him! She got out of bed, made herself coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. She thought about the promise she had made to Henry. She thought about the son she had never known, and she decided it was time. Grace called Marcus. I need your help with something, she said. When Grace told her children about their half-brother, they were shocked, but they weren't angry. They understood. Mom, Sarah said, hugging her mother tight. We're going to help you find him. We're going to do this together. Marcus used his computer skills to search online. Sarah called adoption agencies. Grace wrote letters to the hospital where she had given birth 60 years ago. It took 6 months of searching, calling, writing, and waiting. 6 months of hope and disappointment and trying again. But finally, they got a response. A genealogist named Dr. Williams had found a match. Through DNA records and old adoption papers, he had located a man named Richard Sullivan. He was 61 years old. He lived in Pennsylvania, and he had been searching for his birth mother for 20 years. Grace's hand shook when she read the letter. Richard, his name was Richard. Dr. Williams arranged a meeting. One Saturday afternoon in April, Grace drove to a small coffee shop in Pittsburgh. Sarah and Marcus came with her for support. What if he hates me? Grace whispered as they parked the car. What if he's angry that I gave him away? Then we'll deal with it together, Sarah said firmly. But Mom, he's been searching for you. That means he wants to know you. They walked into the coffee shop. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. And then she saw him. Richard Sullivan sat at a table by the window. He was tall, with gray hair and kind eyes. When he saw Grace, he stood up. His hand was shaking too. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Grace. Richard said softly. Richard, Grace whispered. My son. And then they were hugging, both of them crying, holding each other like they were afraid to let go. I've been looking for you my whole life, Richard said through his tears. I had good parents, a good life, but I always wondered about you. I always wanted to know where I came from. I'm so sorry, Grace sobbed. I was 16. I didn't have a choice. They made me. I know, Richard said. I know, and I understand. I'm not angry. I just wanted to meet you. They sat down together. Sarah and Marcus introduced themselves as Richard's half-sister and half-brother. Richard was amazed. I have a family, he kept saying, smiling through his tears. I have a real family. Grace told Richard everything. She told him about her teenage pregnancy, about her cruel parents, about running away with Henry. She told him about their 60 years together, about Sarah and Marcus, about the life she had built, and she told him about Henry's last wish. Your stepfather, Grace said, showing Richard a photograph of Henry, wanted me to find you. He wanted you to know that you would have been loved, that you were loved. Richard looked at the photograph for a long time. He looks like a good man. He was the best man I ever knew, Grace said. Except maybe you. Richard smiled. Can I ask you something? Anything. Can I call you Mom? Grace started crying again, happy tears this time. Yes, please. I would love that. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of truth, forgiveness, and family. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our touching stories. Over the next few years, Richard became part of the family. He came to Sunday dinners. He met his nieces and nephews. He visited Grace at the house she and Henry had bought 50 years ago. Richard told Grace about his life, his adoptive parents who had loved him, his career as a teacher, his own children. He brought photo albums and shared stories. Grace felt like she was collecting pieces of a puzzle she never knew was missing. One evening, Grace and Richard sat on the front porch, watching the sunset. The oak tree in the backyard swayed gently in the breeze. Do you think Henry would have liked me? Richard asked. Grace smiled. Henry would have loved you, just like I do. I wish I could have met him. Me too, Grace said. But you know what? I think he's watching us right now, and I think he's happy. Richard took Grace's hand. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for forgiving me, Grace said. There's nothing to forgive, Mom. You did what you had to do to survive. And look, Richard gestured to the house, the yard, the life Grace had built. Look at what you created. You and Henry made something beautiful despite everything the world threw at you. Grace thought about those words later that night, lying in bed. She thought about Henry, about their 60 years together, about the secret that had finally been released into the light. The secret had been heavy for so long, but now it was gone. Now there was only truth and love and family. Grace closed her eyes and whispered into darkness, I kept my promise, Henry. I found him. And you were right. Honesty heals everything. Somewhere, she felt certain Henry was smiling. Because after 60 years of marriage, after all the struggles and the pain and the joy, their love story had finally come full circle. Not with an ending, but with a new beginning. A beginning that proved the most powerful truth of all. It's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to heal. And it's never too late for love. Thank you for reading this powerful story of love, loss, and redemption. If this touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring true stories. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought. And don't forget to hit that notification bell. See you in the next story.